the pandemic is probably and inevitably going to have an impact on projects as they move towards completion.
What do you think will be the long-term impact of COVID-19 on the construction industry and claims?
As we've already discussed, the virus is clearly going to have an impact on progress and the cost of implementing the works, and as a result, it's likely to contribute to an increase in the number of disputes between employers and contractors. I think it's also fair to say that it adds another possible ground for dispute on projects where claims already existed. It's likely that if contractors think they've got entitlement to an extension of time and potentially money under a contract, then they're likely to use the coronavirus as an excuse. Equally, if an employer thinks it has a better of an argument relating to the coronavirus under its contract, then it's likely to use that as a defence to the contractor's claims. So, whichever side you're on, as always, we would advise that you take a realistic approach to any claims that you become involved in. And as we've already discussed, taking a sensible, pragmatic approach to the measures that are being undertaken and keeping proper records of the impact of those measures, is vitally important to kind of resolving any disputes that might arise. As Ahmed has already said, ultimately, if you find yourself in a formal dispute as a result of the coronavirus, then your access to justice is still there. There are ways and means for disputes to be heard by arbitral tribunals during a crisis, and I think this also applies to the earlier steps in the dispute resolution process, like mediation, as Ahmed mentioned, or indeed dispute boards that are quite common in FIDIC Red Book contracts. I see no reason why deliberation by dispute boards can't be carried out in many cases on the papers, on the basis of written submissions, or by having a brief hearing by video conference. Looking now more in terms of how it's going to impact on the industry, I think in terms of negotiating subsequent contracts, I think both parties are going to have to look at the impact of the kind of current provisions will have on future projects. We've talked about some of the clauses that may well give rise to an entitlement to extensions of time or money in the situations of the current pandemic, but that position may well change if there are future pandemics of this nature. We may be able to argue for relief for delays or for additional costs under certain clauses in the contract, for example, clause 8.4, but that relies on the pandemic being unforeseeable. Could it be said that if another pandemic occurs in a similar nature in a couple of years' time, that event was unforeseeable, given that we've had the experience of this one? If another pandemic occurred in 2 years' time, would that be considered an exceptional event, under the force majeure provisions? As to negotiating contracts, no doubt we will see employers want to push the risk of a pandemic onto the contractor. But again, I think employers need to think about whether that's actually in their interest, because for example, would an employer want to impose liquidated damages in a period of delay where that's been caused by the pandemic, and then effectively lose the right to impose, hit the cap for those LDs and lose the right to impose LDs later in the contract and lose any, kind of bargaining power they have over the contractor later down the road when the contractor may then fall into delay? Would it be better in the short term to actually come up with some solution with the contractor to minimise risk and cost on both sides, have some kind of mechanism in the contract which will dictate how that works in the case that the pandemic arises? I've just noticed some of the comments coming in. There's some good suggestions on how parties may well be able to actually deal with this in terms of practical aspects on site. For example, potentially looking at more precast elements to the works rather than having everything done at site, particularly if we find a subcontractor has sufficient space on their precast yards to be able to continue production at the same rate, even with the pandemic requirements in place. Would that help speed up works, doing design work off-site and having that all done remotely? I think those are all the kind of things which the industry needs to look at as it kind of moves forward. So I think in short, the post-COVID landscape is inevitably going to be different to that we saw before. But I think it does offer the parties, an opportunity to kind of reconsider how they approach projects and have mechanisms in place to kind of deal with future issues similar to this if and when they arise.